Is this on? Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Can I turn this off so I can talk to you and not everyone listen?
No. And you have some problem, I
Okay.
try to help.
Okay, great.
1 minute. All right, it's 2:15. Welcome to our panel number 1, about peer review and standards and checklists in the age of AI. I'm Andrew Duhovsky from Clemson. Our panelists today include Paul Ralph, Brad Myers, Joachim George, and Rina Weber. So, that's who we were. There was also a couple of people that couldn't make it this time. Stefik is one of the main guys that kind of started this off. We met at Dogstool a few years ago, and we were talking about this, actually 2 Dogstools, and the idea to form this panel came up. Alan Dix couldn't make it either, but he also contributed the slides, as did Krzysz Krates, a friend of mine in Poland. All right, moving along, here is our agenda for today. I'm going to do a quick intro, then we'll look at what the checklists are and the demo coming up. We're going to discuss peer review problems, and there's also a discussion board up here. If you point your phone to it, a Miro board, you can feel free to add stuff to it. There's 5 sort of broad topics. There's AI, science, peer review, and a couple other things. Then we'll talk about pitfalls, impacts, and then we'll do the discussion towards the end of the panel. So first we want to set up what we're talking about, what the standards are, why should we need them, do we need them, should they be required, etc. All right, so the peer review process, as you may know, looks sort of like this, where we have the submission, initial check, the desk rejection. That's what happened to me this year. So I went down there into the toilet. Then there's a review, meta review, and the final decision. Just out of curiosity, how many of you had a paper rejected at CHI this year? Welcome. Join the club. All right. So this is the official looking peer review process, but it feels more like this, especially reviewer 2, who usually bashes you on the head. All right, so I did the first part. It looks like most of us are kind of in the same boat. Do you have any of these impressions that the reviewers didn't read the paper? You know, they want another study? There's a kind of a famous or infamous YouTube video that you can look for, circa 1945. I won't spoil it for you. And these days, which is kind of why we're here, is AI is having a really major impact on reviews. You get the impression that people are throwing your paper into ChatGPT, and that's what's doing the review. Which is kind of odd. So we're going to discuss a little bit about that as well. So the acceptance rate at CHI this year was 25%. That's also an interesting kind of a comment on this, and we have a comment later we're going to discuss, is this a good thing, is this a bad thing? Do we want 25%? What if it was 100%, just to sort of throw that out there? So can the review process be improved in any way? This is what we're talking about, and we're not the only ones considering this. The actual CHI conference this year is having this, another, I guess it's a type of panel, Wednesday. I'm going to put a plug in for them. This Wednesday they're going to talk about the peer review process, and it's kind of complementary to what we're talking about, but they are focusing more on who is doing the reviewing, how many ACs there are, and so on and so forth. What we're talking about more is the content of the paper and using checklists to help write the paper and to help review it. So it'd be nice if the actual CHI folks in charge of this considered what we're talking about here. Hopefully they're here in this room. All right, perfect. So what we're suggesting, it's not really new. In fact, Scott McKenzie used to teach a course at CHI until CHI decided to nix courses. But he taught this course on experimental design, empirical research methods. And towards the end of the course, he would also provide this kind of a recipe, let's say, for the paper. And the important part is, for us, for the checklist, is the methodology. So usually, if we do human subject experiments, human participant experiments, we will put these these kind of subsections. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, is just structuring the research and the paper when you're reporting the results to have this kind of structure, and checklists could help facilitate this. In fact, when I looked at Scott's slides, after I was a professor already, I thought, geez, I wish I had known about this when I was a grad student. It really would have helped me out. And so the checklist that we're talking about here could also help students as they write papers and reviewers when they read them. All right, so I'll hand it over to Paul. He's going to give us a background on this and show you a demo of what these checklists look like.
Thanks, Andrew. Right. Many other fields don't work quite the way computer science does. In many fields, before peer review, they try to agree on what kind of evidence they will accept and how it should be reported. This is rooted in many tragedies in medicine, like the Camden smallpox vaccine disaster, which killed 9 children. This was so horrific that governments legislated standards for drug testing. And since governments first began legislating the ways that drugs are approved, there's been several milestones in evidence and reporting standards. So the first one, in recent history, is the CONSORT group, which established reporting standards for medical experiments. CONSORT originally wanted to establish evidence standards, that is, advice, not just advice, but standards about the way research is done. But they found that they couldn't agree on what makes research methodologically sound, and so they backed off and just said, well, here we're gonna focus on reporting standards, what information you need to provide. And then in 2003, in the US, the federal government imposed quality assessment on federally funded education research. The approach they took with the What Works Clearinghouse is overly prescriptive and restrictive and procedural, and it's really an example of how not to do evidence standards. And we really don't want a government to come and try to apply something like that to computing research, because we will all hate it. Then in 2008, the American Psychological Association created its journal article reporting standards. They started by modifying CONSORT, and again, they originally intended to say more about how research should be done, but for greater political buy-in, they backed off and focused on what information should be reported in papers and how it should be reported. Then in 2019, I recruited a global task force of over 60 methodological experts to create comprehensive evidence standards for ACM SIGSOFT, the software engineering community. Our key insight here was that the reason for so much disagreement about how research should be done is because how you make a randomized controlled experiment with human participants is totally different from how you conduct a systematic review, and that's totally different from how you conduct an ethnographic case study, and so on. To get agreement, we have to break research into a whole bunch of archetypal kinds of studies, and then get the people who do those kinds of studies to agree on what makes those studies good. So once we did that, and we found experts in each individual study type, and then we crowdsourced the standards creation process, we were able to get much greater buy-in from the community. The point of all this is that most people find research deeply mysterious. Even people who have significant expertise in research methods can't possibly remember all of the details of all the different research methods all the time. It's too much. No human can hold all that in their brain. So writing down our expectations makes it easier to teach our graduate students, to design great studies, to write great papers, and to reflect on and improve our expectations. Second big idea here is that we want community-driven standards. Reporting standards are models of a scientific community's expectations for what details should go in a paper. And evidence standards are models of a scientific community's expectations for how research should be done. We need written agreements to decide what research is sound, And when authors and reviewers are working off the same written agreements, we get far less conflict. We need these agreements to be community-driven, to come bottom-up and not be imposed by any one steering committee or editorial board or the ACM or anyone else. It has to be built bottom-up from the community because it's supposed to be a model of what we agree on. They need to be open and transparent and community-driven to work. People get scared when I talk like this. They feel like they're going to be controlled. So let's dispense with that myth for a moment. Here are some excerpts from the APA Journal Article Reporting Standards. This is for quantitative research. Think experiments, questionnaire surveys, closed-ended things, Likert scales, not qualitative work. This is for the quantitative stuff. So let's suppose that you're conducting a closed-ended quantitative survey with Likert scales and maybe structural equation modeling, that kind of thing. So let's do a little audience participation. Raise your hand if. Do you have a problem with requiring papers to state the number of participants? Anybody got an issue with that? No? I didn't think so. Does anyone here think it's okay for studies to conceal the financial incentives offered to their participants? A couple of people. You're in the minority. But there was a couple hands up, okay. And who thinks it's okay to secretly remove outliers? Anyone? No. See, well, they are, but what my point here is that to a great extent, not perfectly, but to a great extent, the reporting standards are just writing down the stuff we agree on. And if we can't agree on it, it doesn't go in the standard. Nobody is being controlled, only by ourselves. The third big idea here is to use standards for peer review. Software engineering, like human-computer interaction, assumes that low acceptance rates will keep out all the pseudoscience and cranks. That doesn't work. There is no evidence whatsoever that this is the case. Evidence, every single study of peer review ever found that peer review is mostly random. Random processes do not improve quality. If peer review is a slot machine, low acceptance rates do not demonstrate quality. Low acceptance rates just demoralize our graduate students. The peer review process is a technological artifact that can be systematically analyzed and improved. It doesn't have to be random. Computer science education has made good strides in this direction. They formally adopted the APA Journal Article Reporting Standards. They basically just took the standards from psychology and said, let's do the same thing and see how it goes. And it's going pretty well. Software engineering is increasingly recommending evidence standards for peer review, but not going as far as I will go in my demo in a moment. I'm going to show the standards. If you want to follow along and the Wi-Fi works, you can use the QR code to bring up our tools. This is live demo of production systems. This is all like running as I'm showing it to you. These things have often gone very badly in the past, so fingers crossed for me, everybody. Telling authors to use the standards is insufficient if reviewers do not. To work, peer review must revolve around the same standards. Therefore, my team operationalized our standards as tools for standards-based peer review. Everything I'm about to show you is free and open source and available on GitHub. It was all built for software engineering, but it is built to be localizable to other communities. So if the HCI or CHI community wanted to do something like this, you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to rebuild all the stuff that we did in software engineering. You can basically just use localization logic to change the software engineering examples to HCI examples and to make other changes that I'll suggest in a moment. Okay, this is our standards site. So first, First, the Wi-Fi is going to break. Nope, it did not. Yay. We created 18 individual standards for 18 commonly used methods in software engineering, plus a general standard for things that seem to apply to all empirical research. By empirical, I mean research that collects and analyzes data, not positivist research. If you wanted to do this in human-computer interaction, you might need to add some things here. For example, you might want a standard for walkthrough-based evaluation methods. In CS education, they would probably want a separate standard for quasi-experiments, which are less common in software engineering, but very common in education. So let's take an example that everybody will be familiar with. Randomized control experiments with human participants. These standards are documents. Each one explains what it is that it applies to, and then it lists the specific attributes. The attributes are the things that we want the reviewers to check. This standard has more than most, but there are often quite a lot of things. The specific attributes vary tremendously across research methods. For example, my previously mentioned ethnographic case study would not have formal hypotheses stated up front, but in a controlled experiment, formal hypotheses are important. We also list desirable attributes. These are things that we want to see in the studies, but not necessarily going to exist in all studies. Some of them might be mutually exclusive. And extraordinary attributes are the things that best paper awards are made of. We included example deviations to remind reviewers that the point of these standards is to guide and not replace human judgment, that there are always weird edge cases where a human being has to think through, is this difference from what is expected okay in this context? Each standard lists common quality criteria for this kind of research, and anti-patterns are things that typically go wrong in this research method. Also, we include a list of invalid criticisms, things that we have noted reviewers saying that they should not have said. The purpose of this is independent third-party fuel for your rebuttal letters. We list exemplars. These are papers that did something right, not necessarily everything right. Again, if you wanted to recreate this for human-computer interaction, you would replace the exemplars with HCI exemplars. And suggested readings often from a mixture of our field and reference disciplines. This is mainly for pedagogy. We also created a series of supplements that I won't go through right now, but that are for cross-cutting concerns like ethics and sampling. And we built all of this into reviewing tools. We set it up so that they give different feedback depending on whether you were an author kind of running through this before submitting your paper or a reviewer. Here, let's choose conference-based review. The difference is not in what you see, but in the way it's scored. And I'll explain that in a moment. Let's choose a different one that everyone will be familiar with. I'm sure you've all read a systematic literature review at some point. So here, I went in before and clicked all the yes buttons so I wouldn't have to do it while you waited. Here, we get asked this series of questions, concise, direct questions. Does the paper state a research question? Does it explain why the paper is important? Does it define jargon and acronyms, and so on? If the reviewer selects yes to all of these questions, then it will load up a list of desirable attributes and say, hey, do any of these apply? But if the reviewer finds lots of problems, it won't bother asking you about desirable attributes if the paper's going to be rejected anyway. This is interactive. It's not just yes and no. If we choose no here, that the paper has not defined some jargon, it will ask us, in this situation, is this reasonable? This is a little nudge to the reviewer. Think this through. Don't just reject a paper because there's a problem. Think about, is this difference from what you expect okay in this circumstance? And if the reviewer says, yeah, it's fine, then it's fine. Moving on. Don't worry about it. In contrast, we might find more serious problems. So if it's not fine, the system will ask you, well, what kind of problem is this? And there are 4 types. The first one is something that can be fixed by fixing some text. This is just an issue with some sentences in the paper, and you can rewrite those sentences and it will be fine. This is not a very serious problem. The second problem is something that can be fixed by redoing a little bit of analysis, but not too much. This is something that is probably in scope to fix in a conference review process. The third type is more serious. Now we're getting into things that can only be fixed by collecting new data or by totally redoing your analysis. And this is something that is maybe feasible in a journal review process, but probably isn't feasible in a conference review process. And the last type is misconduct, things that can't be fixed. Typically unacceptable conduct like harking or p-hacking, or fundamental problems in research design where you're basically saying, you've got to throw this away and do it again. We hope that this doesn't happen very often, but it can happen, so it has to be in the system. When the reviewer selects a type, the system asks, okay, what do we need to do to fix this? When the author sees this, we want the advice to be organized by the problem and not just a big essay. I want you to imagine when filling this out, you got to use your imagination here, right? This is supposed to be integrated into the conference editorial management system. So you're not seeing this in some prototype cooked up by some random professor. You're seeing it in HotCRP or EasyChair or Editorial Manager in the same display that is showing you the paper. Typically on a big screen, you've got the paper on the left, the reviewing form on the right, or maybe you're old school and you've printed the paper and you have it in front of you and the reviewing form up next to it. The idea is that most of these items are in approximately the same order they would appear in the paper. And so as you read the paper, you're ticking off everything through your checklist. Because the author has the same checklist that they're using to structure the paper, this should become more and more straightforward the more people use it. I want to talk about one other issue here. So many people are concerned now about AI-generated reviews. If you load up a sidebar chatbot that can interact with a website, it can interact with these pages to some extent and try to fill it out kind of randomly and stick some text in some boxes. There's a lot that we can do to stop that. There are a variety of techniques to detect AI interaction with this kind of system that are not implemented in EasyChair or HotCRP or any other such system. I'm not going to describe how they work right now because there's a lot of people in this room and I don't trust you. But there are a bunch of techniques we can use to identify and prevent AI interaction with the forms. That said, there are aspects of this that can be automated very carefully and very limited aspects. For example, it is quite likely we could tune a large language model to tell us whether a paper has a data availability section and whether that section has a URL and if that URL resolves to an actual website. That kind of very limited processing may be automatable, but no AI system is ever going to be able to tell you if research has an important limitation that has not been written in the limitation section. We are very, very far away from automating that kind of processing. Okay, back to the We tried all this in an A-ranked software engineering conference called EASE with a randomized controlled experiment in which we randomly assigned program committee members to two groups, one that used a traditional essay-based process and one that used the standards-based process. To be very clear, you are not filling out the checklist and then writing an essay. You fill out the checklist. That's it. That's the review. There's no additional essay. Long story short, we found that standards-based review significantly improved reliability, like inter-reviewer reliability, significantly improved the validity of the reviewing process in the sense of people focusing on research methods and how the study was done and not on superficial stylistic elements. And there was no change in workload or reviewer satisfaction. One last thing. all of this, what I showed you again, is free and available on GitHub. If anybody in this room wanted to propose a new standard for walkthrough-based methods or a supplement about eye tracking or something of that nature, you can just do that now. Nothing is stopping you. The review process is very light. We try to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If anybody right now wanted to start like building out the architecture to localize the system for different academic communities, that's a thing you can just start doing. You should probably talk to me about it first, but that's a thing we can just start. And now, Adegaki.
Okay, thank you. What I'm about to say, the next two slides can be summarized by this whole joke among statisticians that says, if you torture data long enough, it will confess anything. So, we have a problem that fraud detection remains a little bit weak, and many journals and conferences still rely heavily on trust, peer review, and post-hoc scrutiny. Pre-registration means that you should declare a hypothesis, your methods, and analysis plans before seeing the results, and this is still far from routine. And the big issue is that replication remains difficult, undervalued, and often less rewarded than novelty, especially in fast-moving fields. CHI, as a conference and as a venue, has limited explicit space for systematic replication or simple modifications and replications, SMAR-type cumulative empirical programs, because we, as a community, tend to value more novelty than reliability. And that might be an issue. If you have got this great idea, but your p-value does not work, you can legitimately be excused for trying multiple analyses, exclusions, or measures until p goes down below the magical threshold of 0.05. So reporting power analysis could help with this, but in itself it does not resolve the problems of analytical flexibility, weak theory, or selective reporting. AI now has added new risks, including unacknowledged assistance in writing and questionable use of AI in peer review. You know, I think that the real problem here is not only fraud, but really our research culture that often rewards novelty more than reliability. And that's maybe an issue. And of course, we all see that now large language models make it easier to manipulate research workflows by repeatedly changing prompts until you get the output that you want. So this is a variant of torturing the data. Now you torture the prompts, or you torture the LLMs and your model until you get parking, prompt adjustments to reach known outcomes. So parking is this brave new cousin of p-hacking because it both involves repeated tweaking until the result looks publishable or acceptable to R2. The consequence is familiar: inflated false positive risk, weaker credibility, and greater difficulty in replication. Pre-registration might help this by separating this confirmatory work from exploratory work and reducing this kind of hindsight bias. But pre-registration alone is not enough because it does not by itself create cumulative and stable knowledge. This is why CHI could benefit from SMAR, small modifications and replications. A SMAR strategy replicates prior studies while changing one small theoretical meaning factor at a time. Of course, none of us wants to do this. We want to come up with a new interaction technique or organizing principle. Although SMAR could be especially useful for this kind of work: interaction techniques, extended reality, accessibility, human-AI interaction studies, and LLM-based evaluations. So, pre-registration reduces bias, but SMAR builds cumulative evidence. Just by a show of hands, how many of you do think that CHI would benefit from having a pre-registration before the papers are submitted? Okay, a sizable minority. How about SMAR? Should we have small modifications and replication? Another small minority. Yes, we are all for novelty. And with that, there is an interesting paper in the communications of the ACM, prompt hacking, the new p-hacking, that I would recommend you guys to revisit. Briefly, this was on the author side. Now, on the reviewer side, things become more interesting. There is always room for AI slop and a fluent text. The problem with AI is that we can produce lots of text that looks plausible, but you know, it reduces the effort of producing a narrative review, and you can make a bad review, or heaven forbid, but make it look polished. And what it does look like here is the capital sins: delegation, asking a chatbot to write a review, little or no direct reading of the paper, and you know, chatbots are incapable of rejecting anything. They always say, no, this is a nice paper, and offer some general praise. So you get a superficial evaluation, comments that could match your paper or thy neighbors, no engagement with the method or claims, and some lack of basis for claims. So another variant is this kind of skim plus generate. Reviewer skims the paper, LLM expands the fragments into prose, and the confident tone of the LLM hides weak judgment. Maybe LLM can improve the tone of the review, but the question here, does it improve the validity of the claims, the reviewers, or the authors? And what authors notice from this is that you get false claims about what the paper says. This seems, oh, wait a minute, this was my neighbor's paper. Or requests for experiments that are already in paper. No mention of the main contribution, no reference to figures, tables, or limitations. Essentially, AI slop can be a modified version of reviewer number 2. If you don't know what reviewer number 2 is, there is a social network group that I recommend you to visit. The dude agrees. So what shares notice here that are fluent but interchangeable reviews, similar phrasing, judgments unsupported by specific evidence, and very fast turnaround but little substance. And for authors, this might mean unfair decisions. We've all been there, of course. And more revision noise. And this will reduce the trust in reviews. Harder jobs for AC and PC, for assistant shares and program committees, and more appeals and disputes. And for the field, you will get low fluency, low effort evaluation, and weakened standards. And people are taking notice of this. Recent conference tried to injected prompts to try and induce the use of telltale phrases that then could be used to spot reviewers. And the key point, some people were very upset of having their papers desk rejected because of their reviews. So the key point from this is that AI use in review is now more a policy and enforcement issue. And there is another ethical issue that's important. If people feed reviews into ChatGPT, they can be used to be trained the next generation of the large language model. And of course, ACM policies specifically forbid this, and not only ACM. I think the issue here is accountability. Who actually makes the judgment? What standards are there behind the claim? The text can sound expert, but reasoning can be thin or just totally wrong. So one possibility is to set up clear rules. ACM and other organizations are doing this. And treat and declare delegation as misconduct. Ask for specific claims. What in the content of the paper sustains this claim? What sections, what figures, what tables motivated this criticism? And reward reviews that are evidence-rich. And of course, we can do process checks and automate this degree to some extent. So Peer review fails when evaluation is delegated, but accountability is not. Reporting standards and structured reviews can raise the cost of superficial AI use and increase reviewer productivity, and also the quality of reviews. My question after exposing all this is, really AI the problem, or should we make AI part of the solution? How many of you would feel comfortable with going to a conference where you know that a large language model, operating locally, of course, was responsible for suggesting reviewers? Okay, a very small minority there. Associate chairs? Another small minority. How about things like, I had a paper today that was desk rejected because 6 of the references in the bibliography section were non-existent. Why can't we automate these types of checks? Do you think that would be okay? Aha, okay, we are getting somewhere. Okay, thank you for your attention, and I will yield on to the next speaker.
So I was asked to kind of represent the community and talk about some of the things that we're all going to bring up as problems. I think the number one thing that everybody thinks of is the diversity of the kinds of papers that our community creates, the kinds of methods we use. In our HCI program at CMU, we teach more than 30 different methods that are perfectly valid to use in all sorts of different situations, and having this enormous variety of different kinds of methods with different standards would be awkward and difficult. And furthermore, we invent new methods all the time. That's one of the kinds of research that we do, is to create new methods that help elucidate new kinds of questions, and there wouldn't be necessarily any kind of standard for that. And also, we often have mixed method papers, and so then do you have to go through 4 or 5 different standards to review the single paper? That seemed like an awful lot of work. And the different standards will have, different methods will have different roles in the same paper or across different papers. The key reviewing problem, I think we all recognize, is a scaling problem. There's too many papers, reviewing takes too long, getting too many reviewers is hard. Each individual reviewer is already overloaded, and it certainly is a question of to what extent does this actually make more work. The claim is it'll be less work. Certainly doesn't seem like that with this really long checklist I have to go through. Many of the questions will seem irrelevant or like make work. It's like, it should be an awful lot of things to go through and check, which seem really obvious or trivial. And then the skills problem of whether we have, whether this eliminates reviewers that otherwise would be qualified, or whether it actually improves the ability to get reviewers who don't necessarily have a good coverage of the content or the method or whatever. And then finally, there is some evidence. Paul presented the study that showed that this worked in a different field. If we're talking about evidence standards, it seems like we should try to require some evidence before we adopt these standards for our community.
So hi everybody, my name is Rena Webby and I'm here to talk about the impact on researchers, specifically early career researchers. So I myself finished my PhD in 2021 and was hired at Dell in the same year. So I've been doing the early career researcher path and I'm teetering on the edge of no longer being considered early. But because this experience is fresh in my mind, let me talk a little bit on the impact for early career researchers. So of course, when you're an early career researcher, the first thing that you're really worried about is, can I train students effectively? And peer reviews are, of course, a rite of passage to join the community, but also one of the first ways that our voice is included in the academic community. So, before submitting a paper, often we have people do reviews of papers, and when they're ready to start peer reviewing papers, and then as they can publish their own papers and get more involved with the peer review process, we see the learning exchange. So, training is one thing that you might worry about constantly, but what I wish Ed, my PhD supervisor, had warned me about is, yes, it sucks to get your own paper rejected, but it sucks even more to look at your student and say their paper was rejected. And when you're looking at that student and the first thing they're going to say is, why? Why was my paper rejected? Sometimes, when we're lucky, we have a really detailed review that we can talk about. Well, reviewer made this point here, and I think this is a valid point. Or, yes, you probably should represent this as a, an effect size or something like that. And then sometimes reviewers do this thing where they say, contribution isn't strong enough. Methodology is vague. And then, well, you're looking at the student who's got their paper rejected, and you're like, listen, I think it's a good paper. Not all reviewers do the same job. And then you get into the inevitable conversation about, listen, when you're going to submit to CHI, there's so much good research that really we're just picking the top 25% of research. Then you let your students go to conferences and they say, you told me that this method should be done this way. I was rejected from the conference for a similar reason. Why are they in it? Very hard to answer that question. So this becomes a question of how do we engage people in the community, Because being at CHI is something that is a dream for a lot of researchers. And depending on where you're coming from, your institutional value, your funding, you might get to go to CHI, but for a lot of us, it's only if you get a paper accepted. I don't know if that's different for some of you. However, conferences, and especially for younger junior researchers, is more impactful, I'd argue, than for the most senior researchers. Of course, we love our senior researchers. We want you here. We want your advice. But we're missing part of the community that couldn't get here. Paper wasn't accepted, paper wasn't funded, and they may feel that really they're being excluded in some way. But there's also the opportunity that as you engage with peer review, as you engage with the community, that you start to understand the thoughts and the language and the school of thought of the community. However, falling into a school of thought is debatable as well. We do want to be unified as a voice of human-computer interaction, even though that's psychology, computer science, anthropology, humanities, digital humanities, all of this stuff. But we also don't want to be too prescriptive. What is HCI? HCI is an interdisciplinary area. If we make standards and reportings that exclude, like for example, a discipline, if you say we're not going to allow ethnography, how many people would be excluded from our community, right? So this becomes a problem. Training students, managing expectations, and trying to show belonging in the community to your new junior researchers is something that you strive for as an early career researcher, and also to motivate them. But when we have acceptance rates that are 20%, you want to know that the reason your paper didn't get accepted is not because of some lottery. So really here, it's not just CHI, it's all of ACM, SIGCHI reviews. It's also computer science reviews, but it's important to be able to teach a standard of reviewing. And of course, my first CHI was 2013. I want to say that I'm a veteran, but then I look out and I see many of my mentors, and Anna right there, so I'm going to say that I'm not a newcomer. And even in my limited time as part of this community, which is an honor to be part of, I've seen many different versions of the reviewing system. For example, Ed trained me in the art of writing a rebuttal. How many of you had to write a rebuttal? Do we miss it? I liked how quickly the hands fell. Revise and resubmit for the last few years has also been an adventure. How many people have liked that new system? It's interesting, right? But even online, on the steering committee website, on our various social media groups, on LinkedIn, you can see people criticizing or giving us updates about the review process, the template process, the submission process, the DES reject standards. There's a lot of new things every year to consider. Even this year, with the nixing of courses and the change to the schedule, changing the way that people plan their events and plan their conferences, we see a lot of change and differences in the review process that come as a result of that. So, is this peer review process working for us? Now, as someone inside of HCI, being at CHI, I can see the evolution of the submission process, at least from my time here. But when we ask someone like Paul, is this system working, we might get a different answer. So I invite you, Paul.
Right, so again, CHI is not my community, right? But just as we were preparing this panel, Rena was talking me through the proposed changes to the CHI review process. And it's not that they're good or bad, but they don't address the core problem. The core problem is that every study of peer review ever found that reviewers can't tell the difference between good research and bad research. That's the fundamental conclusion. And the only way to address that is by creating more structure in the reviewing process so that we guide people in their decisions about whether methods are sound or not. Anybody who's running a conference in your field can determine this very easily. All you need to do is make a spreadsheet that has all the paper, all the submissions, and all the scores from reviewer 1, 2, 3, whatever, and then run Krippendorf's alpha on it to get an interwriter reliability coefficient. And if the alpha comes out at less than 0.67, let's say, then mathematically that means that whether a paper got accepted has nothing to do with the quality of the paper and is determined entirely by reviewer selection. Nobody wants to be in a community where whether your paper gets in is determined not by what you wrote in it, but by which reviewers you get. That's stupid. No one wants that, right? And so we're never going to have a valid review process that assesses whether papers are good unless we can get a reliable review process in which the reviewers predominantly agree. That's just math. Thanks, Rena.
So of course, a lot of the questions that we've been hearing at town halls at different conferences, and of course we all go to different sub-conferences, so there might be less or more communication about this, is, are reviews meant to be blind? Now, for early career researchers, blind reviews are meant to protect us. They're meant to be able to criticize someone with more seniority in your field, be able to give honest feedback, but anonymous reviews also means that if you get a review that says your methodology is vague, you can't really follow up with that reviewer. Or if you get a review that's one sentence, all you can do is hope that the ACM will intervene on your behalf. And a lot of times, paper ACs are great and do their job, but there are also times when people are overwhelmed. They were thrown on last minute. They found a conflict in the paper while they're reviewing, and you have -2 days because it was due 2 days ago to re-review that paper. And in those times, it can be very difficult to get all of the different ACs to check the quality of the reviews, to check cross-communications. So if we do attach our name, we re-adopt this risk of anonymity, being able to retaliate if somebody saw your review and disliked it. But if we don't remove anonymity, people can get away with a lot, including AI use and LLM use, which of course is also a violation of your trust, because an unpublished paper, you should be able to choose where that data goes. So if someone's putting this up online through these different bots, through these different systems, you're also losing some control over the privacy and distribution of your work. So this becomes another point. Do we want to continue to keep anonymity? Or would we see a spike in quality if you had to be identified? How bad is retaliation in our community? So here's a point of open discussion. So I just want to remind you all that this tiny URL, you can type in or use the QR code to join the Miro board. And now we have a few different questions for you in order to start the discussion.
All right, so one of the first things that, that Alan posed, it's in the Miro board if you want to look at that, but this was an interesting point of discussion, I thought. A successful discipline should have a 100% acceptance rate. What are your views on this? Please feel free to come up and discuss or ask us questions or interact with the panelists. We're all here, so this is just one sort of idea that Alan had. What do you think about this?
No. Look, I like analogies, right? So it's controlling attention, right? So it's what a DJ does. They select what is played to curate an experience. If you had 100% acceptance rate, sure, if you had, the number of papers that you could all read in a single sitting, that's great. But the trouble is we're rapidly producing so much work, and it's not possible to read. I mean, how many papers are actually, I should know this, how many were accepted for CHI this year? What was the number? Was it one?
We have it in the slides at the front.
How many actually got accepted? 1,700. Okay, so how many of them are we going to read this year, or ask our students to read? How many of them are we going to cite? Right? Already the system's broken. We're producing too much. Yeah. And we're all chasing, well, many people in this room are probably chasing the ones, to have a paper that's cited more than twice, right, from that 1,700. Yeah, it's the attentional problem. Herb Simon, it's great to, said, what does a wealth of information produce? A poverty of attention. And that's the trouble. We're producing too much. We just love doing this stuff, but we're not focusing on the consumption side. There's an imbalance between it. We're rewarding production in hiring, in promotion cases, but we're giving no value. We don't even care about consumption. Maybe we teach 1 or 2 papers from 10 years ago. That's it.
Can you get the Miro board up?
Where'd it go? One thing at a time. Yeah. Okay, so one of the great things about standardizing peer review and increasing consistency in review is that acceptance rates don't go up while number of submissions stays static. If peer review, right now, one of the reasons there are so many submissions to a big conference like this is because peer review is random. So everyone feels like, let's roll the dice. Doesn't matter if the paper's crap and we know it, because it's a random process. And so the only way to guarantee I get to go to my favorite conference is to send 5 papers, because it has a 20% acceptance rate, so, then I get to go, right? But if you can make your peer review process really consistent, and the reviewers and the authors are working from the same list of methodological expectations, then people will know certain papers are not going to get in, and so they're not going to send them. So as the acceptance rate climbs, the number of submissions falls. Many conferences are going through this same thing where we can't find enough reviewers because there's so many submissions. But the reason there's so many submissions is because the peer review processes are not working. If the peer review processes were much more rigorous, there would be far fewer submissions. The other cool thing is, standards are not static over time. That as the community evolves, we can jack up our standards. We can basically demand more. We can expect greater degrees of evidence. And we can move from a situation where everybody tries to publish 5 million tiny pilot studies back to the situation where people had dissertations that were a smaller number of bigger, more significant studies, which I think all of us can agree at this point would be better for science, even if it's not better for bibliometrics.
Yeah, so this whole question just came up. Alan's point was that he was suggesting that if we have a 25% acceptance rate, then 75% got sort of thrown away, and he's like, what happened to all that work? Please.
Yeah, thank you. So Jan Borches from RWTH Aachen University in Germany. First of all, I want to say I love the fact that we're actually kind of learning from a related discipline. So Paul, thank you very much for coming in, and thanks everybody else for doing this. I think this is a great idea. And boy, do I have questions. So I'll have three. I'll sort them from like easy to maybe less easy. The simplest one is probably, I love the checklist that you were showing, Paul. There's a bunch of terms in there that maybe not everybody who's doing reviews will be familiar with. Is there already work in progress to basically attach links to explanations of these things? Like, I don't know, did this paper do intercoder reliability, reporting? And if you don't know what that is, then maybe you shouldn't be reviewing, but if you think you should, then take a look here. So is that a thing?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the design philosophies is the sort of levels of abstraction design, where the checklist has to be really concise to not waste people's time, but then it's full of terms you might not know, and we want all of those to be hyperlinks or tooltips where you hover over it and it tells you what it is, or you click on it and it brings you to more information about that term so you can learn about it in context in an efficient way.
Okay. Then secondly, maybe I'm asking Brad's question here, but I think you brought up the point that things might fall into multiple areas. Now I'm asking Brad's question to you, Paul, which is, if something uses multiple methodologies, you'll probably end up with duplicate questions. And is there a way to reduce the make work that Brad was referring to?
Yes, absolutely. So in the current prototype that some of you might have been playing with, you'll see that if you have a mixed method study, you're supposed to select mixed methods as a standard item, and then you select the methods that were mixed, and it will assemble for you an appropriate checklist. Some of those checklists still have duplication due to the kind of simplistic architecture of the tooling, and if anybody will ever give me a grant to work on this, then that's high on my list of stuff to get sorted out.
Okay, so medium difficult. You mentioned there's no essay to write, right? So did you guys consider that providing constructive criticism in the form of, here's an idea of what you could do to make this paper better, should not be in a review? Or is there an extra comment field? Or I'm sure you guys have thought about this, and I would love to hear why you decided maybe not to have that.
So one of the, this is going to be controversial, and different communities may want to do it different ways, but in my community we have a big problem with rogue reviewers who invent criteria that no one ever agreed on and was never in any paper. How come the two treatments in your ANOVA style experiment aren't the same kind of thing? Since when do they have to be the same kind of thing? That's not how interaction works. They just make stuff up, and some of the biggest proponents of our standards-based review are qualitative researchers, because the way that this review form is structured, it discourages a person from imposing a positivist or quantitative criterion on a study where it doesn't apply. And so the decision we made for our field was no general comments field, because it's very important that we discourage these rogue reviewers from inventing criteria that aren't in the standards.
Okay, interesting. This might turn out differently for HCI. I could maybe see that. But so maybe the most difficult question is also the shortest one. You mentioned that we define these standards, and I'd love to understand, in your example, who was we? How did you make this a process where not most of the people in the field will feel left out because some committee, got together, decided on this list, and maybe sent out an email asking for propositions, and then nobody answered, and
Yeah, so there was a few things. Basically, I got this job from ACM SIGSOFT. I didn't SIGSOFT gave me the job of making this thing, right? So that helped. And then the second thing was, I and others tried to figure out who were the people who were most respected in the field, who were experts in these different methods. And we've kind of identified them and invited them and put them in charge. But then they had to produce drafts that then had to be shared with the community, and not shared in a secretive way where it's like, email us your feedback. No, it was on GitHub, write in the issues, suggest the changes, everyone can see all of it. So, because, of course, it's software engineering, so everyone's used to GitHub, right? And we tried to be as transparent as possible in showing where suggestions came from and how they were implemented, and making it so that it wasn't just that you could complain about something, but you could just put in a pull request saying, change this sentence to that sentence. And for the most part, almost all of these things were accepted or fiddled with and accepted.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Hi, Hamid Khamis, University of Glasgow. Thank you for organizing this. I think it's a very interesting topic and very good to discuss that. So a quick thing to follow up on what Duncan said about the increase in number of submissions. I think this will always be a problem simply because there is more and more researchers every day and more PhD holders, more research is being done. And as a result, obviously catching up with all of that research. But I think my thoughts about this, I feel like we need to take a step back and ask ourselves uncomfortable questions on whether the concept of papers is actually reasonable today at all. Because the concept of papers is like more than 300 years old, and it's even older than the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution. So shouldn't we come up with a new way of presenting knowledge and summarizing knowledge? And it's a difficult question, a difficult thing, because obviously everything in academia is built on it. It's our bread and butter, our papers, academic progression is built on that. But we need to address this, or otherwise, I think we may lose. Basically, our work may not be significant anymore, because basically now people are not catching up with the research. People are reinventing wheels. Do you have any thoughts about that? If the concept of papers, is there an alternative today to the concept of papers at all?
There's a mic on the table. Go ahead. Me? Anyone, I don't know. What do you have any suggestions for an alternative to papers?
Probably not a popular, that won't be a popular opinion, but I think over time, the task of reviewing will eventually, we will be able to build models that can do that very well, even if today's models are not able to do it well.
I would, sorry, go ahead.
I think at some point we will be able to automate the process of checking research whether the research has been done well. And I think if we have a way to feed research in a way that is queryable, that we can query, like what's the latest research on that topic? I'm working on this product now and I want to know what's the latest on that topic to build, a product that is state of the art and everything. And if I can pull out the results somehow of what is the latest research on that, what is the most valid research about that, and also the authors get their citations, or whoever submitted that research gets their citations. It aligns with the idea of everything gets accepted somewhere, but it also gets reviewed automatically. So it's kind of like the opposite.
Yes.
I was going to say that CHI itself has identified an addition to papers. Over the last few years, videos went from being optional to being more required, and not just one video. We had 1 year the 3-minute, the 1 minute, and the 30-second. But also, we've accepted posters and data sets as well, right? So the papers do evolve. But I mean, we've also seen excellent work come from CHI. For example, Damien Mason, University of Montreal, did a project where the PDF was made available to a software he called Charmeleon, and the images and the data could be pulled with the software and played with. I really love that idea because it makes the paper, the PDF, you embed the actual work in it. And were Damien here, I would invite him to speak about it more. But we have seen solutions like that from CHI. The problem is we haven't adopted them at CHI.
For computer science, I would also throw in that code is something that's out there, and so GitHub or whatever, you can share your code, demos, things like that. So, yeah, the papers are evolving, I think.
I think there's another perspective on papers as a presentation medium and as a way of building community and of meeting the people who are doing relative work. So independent of the written paper, there's the ability to get people together to find the people working on topics that you're interested in as they're presented at the conference. So I strongly disagree with Paul's idea of accepting everything. That I think as a community we have the role of identifying a few interesting papers that should be presented in a community so that we can get together and talk about the topics that the papers represent, which, you know, could be, the written paper could be done in a different way and still serve that role.
Okay, so I'm not in complete agreement with either of these ideas. I think it would be great to have a track specifically for students that does have a really high acceptance rate, but only because we're missing their voices, and training students in the conference is easier than trying to relay what a conference is and what crosstalk is and what kind of questions they'd get. Because truly, it's nice to see a paper, but it's better to see good discourse about a paper.
So just a final comment about that. I think these are all great ideas, and the idea of code and so on, that's all great. But I feel like if the concept of a paper itself, as in like this is the only way or the main way of presenting the research, is not going to keep up, and we may need to want to explore using those mediums instead of papers in the future. But yeah, but thanks, that was a good discussion. Thank you.
Hi, Alessandro Soro, Queensland University of Technology, Australia. I think I have a bunch of thoughts and they're a little bit sparse. I'm wondering if I'm the only one in the room who actually likes the peer review process as it is. Not because it's not painful, but because papers come out better at the end. And you know, to answer some of what was said, that's what I tell my students when they come to me and say, why? Well, it's not why, and it's not about comparing your work to somebody else's work. It's about comparing your future work to the current work and using all the feedback you're receiving in the best possible way, which sometimes also involves realizing whether you've been misunderstood, and so you need to kind of clarify better. Or if you simply disagree with the reviewer, which is, you know, you're allowed to disagree with reviewers and just, you know, hold on to your guns and make your point, which, by the way, that's what we used to do in rebuttals that, you know, I missed a little bit. Not that it worked all the time, but sometimes it did work. And the other aspect that I like of the peer review system is that I don't see that as a filter for this reason. I see that as a peer mentoring kind of process. So I think it's very reductive to see that as a filter and thinking in terms of this paper should stay out, this paper should go in. To me, it's always more productive thinking of it, you know, looking towards that 100% acceptance rate, just not necessarily at each conference, right? You know, along the way, may need to be submitted and then submitted and resubmitted again, but then good papers and good research goes in. And you need that sort of, you know, community participating in this process. The other bit that I like is, and the other thing that I tend to remind my students is that on the other side of the fence, there's a person like you who's doing, you know, as best as they can to give you feedback, and they have nothing to gain in the process, by the way. They are reviewing your paper for free. You get the paper in if the whole process is executed properly. That being said, I do welcome some of the suggestions. For example, AI in reviews. I kind of like the idea, especially when AI in review can do some of the minion work that I don't like doing, including checking those references. I think, you know, lately we've been asked to check that all the references exist, and I wonder, well, you know, having humans double check the work of AI, that should be working the other way around, really, right? We can use our time a little bit better. So if we have some system we can implement that takes a lot of that out, and maybe also just thinking in terms of desk rejection as a courtesy we can have to authors sometimes. If the paper just doesn't have an opportunity to get in, just, you know, a quick kill is better because it gives everyone the opportunity to send the paper somewhere else. I've seen a lot of, you know, participating program committees. I've seen a lot of sort of reluctance to desk reject and reluctance to reject when a papers need to be rejected. If a conference like CHI accepts 20%, 25% of the papers, why are we wasting a lot of time, discussing something that is clearly in the bottom 20%, right? There should be a quick out for authors to grab their feedback immediately and just resubmit somewhere else. So I agree, CHI needs to improve paper and peer review quality, but improving it's part of our job description. But at the same time, I'm not sure that it's through standards alone. Right.
Okay, I want to question some of your premises here. So one thing, you said that peer review is good because it makes papers get better over time. I'm not sure that that's the case. I have a question for the audience. Everybody, eyes up, it's audience participation time. Who here can remember a time when they changed a paper in a way that they thought was methodologically or statistically incorrect to make a reviewer happy? Not as many as I thought would raise their hands, but still too many. I guess this is a thing that's like correlated with how much of an expert you are in the methods you use. When I very frequently am told by reviewers to do stuff that is statistically wrong or that is methodologically out of whack with published guidance. And it's not because they're jerks, it's because they don't know any better. They're trying to review for a method they don't really understand. We got a couple here, and then you go ahead. And part of this is, I told you not to put in that 100% acceptance rate thing. That is not my idea.
That was Alan.
Okay?
But it sparked discussion, which is what we're supposed to be doing.
Okay. I think that standardization makes acceptance rates go up because it increases agreement about expectations between authors and reviewers. And that makes papers better when they get to the peer review. Not because this is not about lowering standards. This is about raising standards, but being much more clear about what we want people to do so people aren't all confused all the time. And then the next thing was, you said, the peer review process is about mentoring. And I love your optimism. But I submitted my first paper to AAAI, the big AI conference, when I was 19. And when the reviews came back, one of the reviewers said, consider a different career. Okay? That's not mentoring. That's being a jerk. Now, I'm not saying that reviewers never engage in mentoring. Surely they do. Many reviewers do. I try to when I'm a reviewer. But as a whole, I don't think the review process is effective as a mentoring process. I think if you were trying to design a mentoring process, you'd build something totally different. Ready?
I would like to disagree with Paul in one thing, that I think reviews can be constructive. I've been known to find one or two every other leap year. So, but I totally agree with your comment of desk rejection as a service. It is. Quickly rejecting papers because they are not in the right field or they are insufficiently developed is a service to the authors and to the community. And the other thing I think that's also important in the review process, writing a paper or writing a book, some kind of structured intellectual output of your work forces you to think whether your hypotheses were right, whether you took the correct approach, and this act of self-reflection is important too. So you need to have some form of structured output to force yourself to think before you share your thought with others. So there is a conflict between immediacy and structure, and you should solve it in the terms of structure. But yeah, quickly desk rejecting papers is a favor that you do to authors.
Yeah, but keep in mind too that what we're promoting here is these standards, checklists, and reporting standards. We're not trying to totally get rid of the peer review process or anything like that. We're just trying to make it easier.
That was also my understanding, by the way. Just a quick reply, right? I can see your point. I've received some of those reviews as well. I think it was part of my, growing as a researcher also. Learn how to metabolize those kind of, reviews and learn how to potentially push back if I thought that was the case. And as a matter of fact, I agree it was a little bit, she lacked sometimes maybe, but I also happened to have encountered some associated chairs who just explicitly in the meta review said, look, You don't have to add a reference that you don't think are pertinent. You don't have to feel bullied into doing changes that you don't think are relevant and something like that. But then again, is it about standards? Maybe it's about training. Maybe it's about growing the community and growing like a pool of ACs that can really, sometimes have the guts of, making decisions without asking others to agree. That's the rest of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I actually wanted to speak on your point about mentoring. And I'm going to argue that the rebuttal kind of gave us a little bit more opportunity for back and forth conversation. Because right now it's very one way. So for example, when Paul asked, have you been given advice that statistically is inaccurate, that goes against your paper? Yes. For example, I've been told, you should use an ANOVA. But if we had a rebuttal, I could reply back, this is not continuous data, which is one of the underlying statistical assumptions of ANOVA. However, when it's just one way, it's less mentoring and more prescriptive. So I know rebuttals are unpopular, hard to write, stressful, the whole 9 yards, but at least it was a conversation.
Hello, I'm Wendy Mackay from INRIA in France. And I wanted to take a step back and say, we're talking about peer review as if it's a single thing, but we're part of a really large socio-technical process, if I may use those words. And we have many, many, many goals and values associated with peer review. And I would say that CHI, unlike most of computer science, has a broader range of different types of research that we do. And I actually have my foot in many of these different, I do qualitative, I do design, I do hardcore stats, I do the whole range. And the way I want to be guided with a set of guidelines is very different in each of those fields. And so the closer I am to performance-related evaluations of a novel interaction technique, the happier I am to have a discussion about ANOVA and whether it's the appropriate statistical test, et cetera. Because the value of the paper is based on, can I show that this is a higher performance, I can generate higher performance for my users than if I use some other method. But when I'm trying to open up a new way of thinking about something, when I'm trying to challenge standard things like, why do we think that working with an LLM is going to be chat-based? Why can't we have tool-based interaction with these things? Why can't we think about this in a different way? Why do we have to? Those things are not based on the quality of a particular method, but they're about the quality of the ideas, the kinds of things we're trying to do. So my first point, since everybody else is doing multiple points, I'll do that too, sorry. First point is we're part of a much broader range of different kinds of research than you would find in software engineering. I'll just say that, and I think we can prove it. And I disagree with some of the things that you said because we are also a community, and a community that cares about community. And there's a lot of blah, blah, blah about that, but fundamentally, I've been with CHI since 1983. I think Brad is probably one of the few other people in this conference who can say I've been to all of them. So I've seen it grow, I've seen it change, and I've seen the role that this peer review process has. And it means that it literally is a way of meeting young people, bringing them through the process. When we had face-to-face meetings, and I see two chairs of WIST over there that are going to do a face-to-face program committee meeting for WIST in Copenhagen in a few months. That was an incredible community builder. And I used to keep track of stats in the down moments during the PC meetings, looking at the numbers that people gave, because we used to do a 1 to 5 thing, and which papers were above and below the accept line. And obviously the ones at the very top are going to get in, and the ones at the very bottom are not going to get in. But we actually have a really wide section in the middle. And the discussion around those, what are the pros and cons of this particular paper versus that, has this property of both giving better feedback to the users because, the authors, because that goes back into the summary about why you did or didn't get your paper in, but also it's educating the community. It's teaching people how we value and what we value. And that changes over the years. In the early days of CHI, psychologists would talk to computer scientists about, like, How do we make, faster interaction? And then we got design in there, and we got the social sciences in there, and we got all kinds of, and it's been evolving and changing really rapidly and constantly. And so when we think about what are we trying to accomplish with the peer review process, we're not just trying to make a bunch of in or out decisions. We are literally, and we have successfully over many years, built community through this process. It is our way of getting together. It's our way of valuing things. It also has a huge impact on careers. It has a way of helping people sort of get better at making arguments about why their work is good. It's teaching and so on. And so I think, sure, there's a part of me, especially the experimental psychologist part of me from my earlier career when I used to do a lot of stats. And so I love the checklist. It's great, sure, good. For that kind of work, great. But for other stuff that I do, and I would love, you said that the qualitative people like it. I just did some work on how to do rigorous qualitative stuff, and I think there's a lot of stuff that should be said about how do we evaluate qualitative work well. So yes, there's a role for that, but checklists and no comments and ignoring the fact that we are in this community and that we are trying to help each other, what Brad said about figuring out what's interesting and who is my community. And when I talk to my students, I say, who do you want to read this paper? Who are the people that you want to be excited about your work because you're excited about their work and you want to have that conversation? How do we do that? And peer review has been an imperfect, but part of the methodology that we use as a community to do that. And so I'm torn, right? And there's part of me that says, great job. I mean, what you did is really impressive, and I'm, happy about the fact that it works as well as it does. But boy, I would not want to see it just applied, with no comments and just we're going to come up with, and everybody has to figure out, like, what kind of paper have I got right now in this thing, because it's all multi-method. That I don't see. I mean, I'm on Brad's side there. I think, as a community, we've got a really broad range of things we're trying to do. That was not a comment, a question, but I will, I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, I think one of the things that brought to mind is, in some sense, the evaluation in many of our papers is the most boring part.
Right.
And it would be great to use these checklists for section 8 of the paper, but the meat of the paper is the new idea, the implementation, the creative tool, what it does and whether that's interesting. And unfortunately, none of the things we're talking about would help the reviewers do a better job of deciding if this is an interesting tool or not, independent of what the evaluation says. Right. You can almost always find a community of people that can use this tool easier than a competing tool, independent of which those two are, and do that methodologically sound with, and still have a really boring result because the fundamental thing you're trying to show wasn't interesting in the first place. So
I just want to make a historical note and say that Kai has not ignored this issue. So in 2013, when I chaired Kai in Paris, I worked with some other folks. Max is over there. We did something called Replicai. We were looking at replication and honoring papers that had done a good example of replicate and extend, show us that you've thought about what's going on and then going on beyond that. And we had a whole set of things going on. We had a number of discussions about pre-registration and so on and so forth. So this has been a discussion in our community for a number of years for various reasons that I will not get into unless Max wants to stand up and talk about that. Probably not. There was a lot of pushback in doing that. And I just want to say, there's part of me that's fundamentally on the side of doing this kind of work. We've been actively involved in trying to think about how to make that part of our work as good as possible. But as Brad says, there's other stuff that we do too. I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you.
I just want to say that you make a great point about the committee meetings having this opportunity to measure worth of papers, but it's also a closed meeting. And sometimes the reviews, what happened at the committee meeting, is not always included in the review feedback. So my PhD supervisor at Lank would love to make this joke every Chi to remind us that even if the work is good, you're going to find a home for it eventually. He'd walk into the lab, he'd turn to Dan, and he'd go, "Hey, Dan, do you remember that time my paper got all 4s and then got rejected at the committee meeting?" And he would make that joke every year. And the paper got rejected multiple times with high scores. It became a nemesis paper. And it was hilarious. And it was his way, even after it got accepted, of saying that if your work is good, keep working at it, do good work, and find a home for the paper. But really, this feedback from the committee meeting used to be sometimes given through shepherding, if you had a borderline paper. And then you had somebody from the committee who had heard the feedback that's able to guide you. That was another mechanism we could use. But we have seen that there are review times that we get reviewers that mismatch the papers, and that's resulted in change to our committees. So for example, Understanding People now has the qualitative track separate from the quantitative track from the mixed methods, because we had a lot of quantitative reviewers assigned to qualitative papers, and of course the war between those is well known.
So I like to have discussions based on evidence, right? And so a few things. One, the standards projects that we created is not for opinion pieces. You don't have a checklist to evaluate an opinion piece. That doesn't make sense, right? The checklists are for empirical research. The second thing is that when you do surveys in communities about peer review, the people running the peer review processes overwhelmingly think that they work. And the graduate students overwhelmingly think the peer review is a load of crap, right? Basically, the higher up in the community you are, when you're on the steering committee, when you're the program chair, when you're running stuff, when you're in the meetings that determine, you see your process and you think, yeah, this is a really good process. Well, probably not, because everybody from the outside doesn't think it's a really good process, and every time we do a study of one of these processes, it finds that they're mostly random, and what's not random is prejudice. So we need to stick to evidence. Community building only works if you haven't abandoned the community because your dissertation didn't get published. You have to be there to be in the community. You have to be in the room for the community building to work. Again, people, the older you are, the higher you are in the community, the more you tend to believe that you are in the process, that you are mentoring and that you are helping. And the younger you are, the newer you are to the community, the more you tend to believe that all of this is obstructionist and that it's not helping and that it has no relationship to mentoring. It's not that one side or the other is right, but we want to make decisions based on evidence, based on questionnaire surveys within your community, not just assuming that people agree with you. So evidence is good, but one last thing about evidence. Whenever I talk about this whole checklist thing, people say, well, where's your evidence that it works? And I say, I did a randomized controlled trial at an A-rank conference, right? But even so, at every conference you go to, the program chairs and the general chairs change stuff all the time on a whim because they had an idea. They don't have evidence for any of it. So when they come and say, oh, where's your evidence? The correct response is, shut up. You want evidence, pick a conference, try it. And if it doesn't work in your community, then don't do it. But don't look and say, oh, well, someone should produce some evidence. No one else is going to produce evidence for you. You have to do it. You have to do it yourself for your community. Okay, end of my rant.
Just a quick program note that we're just 2 minutes left. I'm happy to stick around. We can stick around, but if you have someplace else to go for other parts of the CHI, we're kind of running short on time, but please.
Hi, I'm Farhana, PhD student at Cornell. On Wednesday, we're presenting a paper on peer review biases in HCI, and just bringing two things from our participants. So right now, HCI conferences do not have any formal procedure for the authors to seek grievances or report any problematic reviews. So many of our participants were reporting that ACL has recently started this reporting mechanism to hold accountable problematic review practices. Not to say that HCI should follow NLP conference models, but to discuss a path forward from many of these NLP or ML venues who deal with scales that are usually higher than HCI conferences. The other thing that came up from participants was like, right now PCS collects 3 different inputs from ACs regarding review quality, and of course, not all reviews like provide those feedback. And as Kai has all these PC reports that come out with lots of statistics, with acceptance and other things. So one thing is like, is there a way for HCI to consistently deploy, like demand for ACs to provide these review quality feedback and provide more report on the quality of reviews across different subcommittees, which I'm hearing that is going to be discarded, questionable, but yeah, like just more statistics on the transparency and quality of reviews, because when this, like already the interface supports this, just more like implementing that and making those data available to the community. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we can listen to the question. Yeah.
Well, Wendy said it much better than I could about qualitative work, but everything you've been saying doesn't sound to me like it's conducive to reviews of qualitative papers, and that's just a quick comment. I wanted to ask you a question about your checklist, your online checklist, and that is, as you were going through it, I identified what looked to me like, and by the way, I'm an independent researcher. I got my PhD at Northumbria University 8 years ago, and in design research, and my thesis was entirely qualitative. And I work for a digital agency, and I do user research and accessibility work, and so as you were going through your checklist, I noticed some things that struck me as not only usability problems, but accessibility problems, and I wanted to ask you if you have conducted an accessibility audit on that checklist, and if not, then to urge you to do that before you release it for general use.
Yeah, so I primarily do grounded theory, and so I'm very aware of the concern that like some of these items seem like they're very quantitative. So I just brought up the grounded theory checklist so you can compare. You'll see that it's very different from the quantitative ones. About the accessibility thing, so
thank you.
We have no money for this project at all. $0. I've applied for 8 grants for this. No one will fund a peer review system. And so as soon as someone gives me some money, accessibility audit is on my list.
You shouldn't do accessibility as an add-on. You should build it in from the start.
Well,
otherwise you're leaving out a number of your possible users. So I consider that answer unacceptable.
I'm sorry, but it's the world.
Well, don't release it into the world until you've had a chance to do it. That's all. That's all I'm saying.
So I do agree that accessibility should be forefront. And unfortunately, I wish you did have more funding. And let's remember that the proposal is, would we like to do a system like this for Kai? And if we did do so, one of our tenets would be that accessibility is grounded in our work. But what I'm saying is computer systems sometimes prioritize different things.
Hi, I was just wondering, since you mentioned blind reviews and how you don't like not knowing who the reviewer is, would you consider the double blind? Because I have some anecdotal stories that people from lower universities that aren't that much popular, that don't have big names on their papers, get rejected just based on that. So wouldn't maybe a double-blind review with a system that we can actually communicate with the reviewer but still remain anonymous, both as a writer and the reviewer, would that be better?
I 100% agree to a double-blind reviews exactly for the reasons you stated. And I think on the other side of transparency, some communities are experiencing with systems like Open Review, where you make anonymous reviews readable by other people than the author, and that has a positive effect, or seems to have a positive effect on the quality of reviews. Sorry.
I also agree. I think it would be a great opportunity for mentorship.
Thank you.
There are some studies on anonymity in reviewing. The evidence is a bit mixed. Some evidence suggests that basically when reviewers are anonymous, review quality goes down. We make reviewers anonymous to protect them against retaliation. It's not clear that that works super well, but it's kind of an open question where we don't have good answers yet.
I mostly meant can the authors stay anonymous so that I don't get rejected because I'm not the most popular researcher in that field?
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
So we have mixed evidence on that too. So we know that anonymizing authors reduces prejudice in a review process, and there's lots of evidence that if you don't anonymize the authors, you get all manner of prejudice in a review process. But when we make the authors anonymous, we have, you don't take a reputational hit for submitting a bad paper, and so that probably adds to the AI slop papers and people just submitting everything even if it's not done to conferences problem. So again, it's a sort of mixed bag, right, where it's with pros and cons.
Okay, I'm last, so I'll try and be quick. One of the things I think we haven't discussed today, which surprises me, is training people to be good reviewers. It's a skill to write a good review, and it's quite a daunting thing to start with. So I happen to edit a small HCI journal called Interacting with Computers, and we've been running a training program for reviewers, which has been really great. And I think it helps people, and I emphasize this, it helps people to write better papers as well, because when they see what happens when they go into review, and one of the things we've done is show them some of the terrible reviews we have personally received. So I think we have to stop people writing reviews, you should get another career. That is a really cruel thing to say. And when you see it from the other side, yes, I've written reviews where I've got really angry with the authors because I think they're doing rubbish research, but then I have to think, okay, I don't want to send this review to people. But we run quite a long program. It's about 8 hours where we talk about what makes a good review. We get people to read other reviews for papers and then write reviews, and we give them feedback. So I think we need to be nurturing people to be good reviewers, which we don't seem to be doing very much at all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Kristen Williams, Emory University. So I have 2 questions / points. One question / point is, have you thought about the adversarial reviewer?
The what?
The adversarial reviewer. Oh. So I feel like I've started to see this a lot with the assisted desk rejects, where people are using that to amplify their editorial voice in a way that maybe is not merited for what should otherwise be peer reviewed.
Yeah, so in the current configuration of the peer reviewing prototypes, a paper is only rejected when the reviewers agree on a problem. So if the reviewers have to agree that the problem exists, the specific problem exists. If only one of the 3 reviewers says this is a problem, then the system ignores it. And this is how we get rid of it. So it's only if you get all of the reviewers are adversarial, which would be very bad luck. I mean, it can happen, but the primary mechanism against this is analyzing differences among the reviewers' opinions. That's what we got.
And then the second question / point kind of tags onto something that Wendy said, which is about the socialization process. And I wonder to what extent this has been thought about as CHI has scaled. I mean, even in just my limited time, I've seen the attendees double. And one thing I noticed about my senior colleagues is they had great mentorship on how to AC and review. They physically traveled to places where they spoke with their mentors in the hallways. They talked about borderline papers. And I think the thing that seems to be missing nowadays is that socialization process of how to adjudicate the hard cases. I know Zooming is trying to do some of that, but when I think about stories, like I think Hiroshi Ishii has a story about his famous tangible bits paper being on the cusp of being, rejected again, and now it's one of the most groundbreaking papers in our field. What is the socialization process for discussing the gray cases, and how does that fit in with what's being talked about in terms of standardization?
I'm not buying into this peer review as a socializing process thing. Like, I think the socializing process in academic communities is super important. I don't think that has anything to do with peer review. This idea that we have like peer review meetings where we're all going to be like friends after, like, I don't know what y'all are talking about. We don't have, in software engineering, we don't have any in-person program committee meetings. We got rid of all of it on the basis that it was exclusionary and its carbon footprint. We do all of them online. That's not how, that doesn't mean you have to do it that way, but I'm not at all convinced that this is a good way of socializing people.
Okay, I'm kind of on the edge with that. I do think that peer review is the first time you do get to submit your voice to the community, though I wish we had a system such as your lab has been assigned 5 reviews. Can you train your young researchers or your junior researchers? And both of you are reviewers. So that way they can have their chance to be the voice of the community. They write the first draft. Their opinions are not overshadowed by their supervisor, but their supervisor takes active responsibility in ensuring the reviews are good. And that's something that we should do for our students anyway, right? When they're writing their first review. I mean, I remember my students being nervous. Oh, what if I write a review that's not great? What if the AC doesn't like my review? What if the AC comments on my review? And part of that process is, yeah, they will comment, hopefully. They will pay attention, hopefully. And trying to teach that that's good. But we lose the social part as we increase the number of reviews. So for example, if you write a paper right now, you should promise to do 3 reviews. For me, I keep my group small. But my colleague Rita, for example, has like 17 to 23 students. And if all of them were to submit a Chi paper, that's quite a lot of reviews that she must promise. And that's an unreasonable number for one person to do.
Yeah, I just kind of want to add on to this discussion we're having about qualitative research, because I honestly don't, I'm not as polarized as I think that it's terrible to have standards in qualitative research, especially as someone whose work deals with marginalized communities, because I have gotten reviews back that are like, why should we care about Black people? And I'm like, there's nowhere in the list that said that would be one of the questions I got asked. So for me, it's kind of like, I would love to have standards that I could look at beforehand to see okay, where do I actually need to be concerned with my research? Where are the places that I need to look at those things? Because that is a thing you learn after being a researcher for a while and knowing that these are the types of questions that you're going to get asked about your research. Do you want to respond to that? Oh.
I'm so sorry to hear that someone said that to you. That's horrifying. I can't even begin to process that. But also that shows another failure of the system. HC should step in and be like, hey, racism.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that we put in every single standard this invalid criticisms thing. So one of the invalid criticisms is you can't say this group of people isn't worthy of study. It doesn't matter what the group of people is. People, researchers have to tell you who they studied. But once they say, we studied software developers in Nairobi or whatever, then you just have to go, okay, because every group is worthy of study.
Yeah, and I think also, I don't know if this is necessarily a thing that having the standards will help with, but I think it's important, you kind of touched upon this earlier, is talking about how, I'm a PhD student, Jalen Zabala, Northeastern, forgot to say all that. And like even in this room, like as people have come to the microphone and asked questions and responded to questions, you can see that like when you are a senior researcher or like someone that has more respect due to whatever identity group you're in, you can be more adversarial. You can be more aggressive and more like direct in the things that you're saying, and that's okay. And that's also kind of one of the hard things with, or like one of the things that I feel like anonymity affords for us.
That's really true. You have this invested social capital that you can use to be more direct if you're more senior. And sometimes that's a great thing, because I personally really hate it when people try and give you a really roundabout way of saying exactly what they want to say, because clarity indeed is kindness. But there is also the problem of that we weigh that voice really heavily. And as people get more senior, the field changes. And oftentimes we see that some mentors respect and understand changes to the field and say, well, this is how I would do it, this is what I've seen. But we've also seen people become very absolute, my way or the highway. And that's not always helpful. What I really liked about Paul's approach is that it is based on research studies. So Paul doesn't necessarily give you his opinion without a citation all the time, which is nice. But also Kai does have these really interesting offshoots. And I think that was why Alt Kai was so great, because you had a completely different reviewing process, a completely different standard of ideas. But again, we're moving away from that. So where do these papers fit? How do we include diversity? Where does creativity factor in? And of course, for those people in the younger generation, sometimes creativity is mistaken for like misappropriation of methods. So there is a need for balance.
We are, by the way, way over time. I don't know if there's something else coming up in this room, but I want to thank everybody for showing up and participating in our panel, and thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but